Okay. Well, welcome everyone to this evening's program. We deeply appreciate your time, and we hope that everyone is staying healthy and doing well. I'm Dr. James Broomall, an associate professor of history at Shepherd University and the director of the George Schuyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War. And with me today is our administrative assistant, Catherine Magi. Catherine was awarded her BA from American University and her JD from the College of William and Mary. She most recently co-authored with Dennis Fry an excellent book on Harpers Ferry, Confluence, and she has been incredibly integral to our programming over the past 6 months. And Catherine has a lot of varied interests from epidemics and pandemics to cocktails and transcendentalists. And so what we're going to do is offer a couple different programs through the center over the next month. As we've been doing, we're going to ramp up our efforts here. And so with that, I think I just want to give a very quick overview. I think in the news today, a lot of you have heard the term Spanish influenza or the Spanish flu, the 1918 pandemic. And so we wanted to contextualize this catastrophic global event in a very local way by looking at how it unfolded in Jefferson County, West Virginia, where of course we are located. That's the eastern panhandle of the state. We're about 50 miles from Washington, D.C. And for those of you who don't know, the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic was really quite catastrophic. About 500 million people worldwide were infected. And that means about 1/3 of the global population was impacted by this disease. And of those, around 50 million people perished. And so it's truly a catastrophic event in the midst of the World War I era, this unbelievable contest that also had global reach and cost millions of lives, billions of dollars, and had untold destruction. And so actually these two events are going to interface a number of different ways. And as Catherine is going to explore and relate to us this evening. And so with that, do you want to say anything just at the get-go here, Catherine, before we get started?
I can talk maybe a little bit about how this, guys, I do have a lot of strange interests. As you've already mentioned, I do a lot of work in Harpers Ferry. There's the book on Harpers Ferry. One of the things I really love about Harpers Ferry and about Jefferson County is that it has always seemed to me this stage where we can explore so many big national stories at a very personal level, where so many different movements and big characters and big stories come together and meet. And this is one that I had not heard before, told and articulated in its own story. And so I started looking for that because whenever I encounter a question, I encounter a story like this, a bigger story, my instinct these days is always to go home first, always to go to Harpers Ferry and start there and say, what is your story? What did you do? So that's how this began. Do you want me to go what I've done?
Yeah,
okay.
That's wonderful. Yeah, and I think one of the things that's so important for our viewers out there to think about is the importance of local history. There has been a lot written, a lot of what microhistory case studies over the past couple decades that have just been incredibly revealing. And so I think what we can often understand in the microcosm is these macro events. And so, I'd encourage those of you out there, and we have a lot of people tuning in from New York, Massachusetts, Maryland, if you haven't investigated your local history, see how that can inform your understanding of the broader world. And I think here is an excellent example of how this global event can be contextualized in a very specific way, as Catherine's going to do for us this evening. And I think what was so interesting as we started this discussion that I hadn't really considered is this problem of censorship. And so this is the era of a catastrophic war, World War I, 1914 to 1918. And so in the midst of this global contest, at the very tail end of it, this epidemic breaks out. And of course, the two are directly interfaced with the mass movement of peoples and so on. And so tell us a little bit about censorship and how it sort of impacted public understanding of this event as it started to unfold in 1918.
Sure. Let me step back for a second, and I'll get to that in a moment. Just the experience of the person who's looking for the story, looking for a story where censorship might be an issue. As I said, I like to start at home. So one of my favorite resources when I'm trying to find a story is to go to newspaper archives. And this is what I did. I went to the archive of a newspaper that I've used for so many other story collecting purposes and had wonderful success with. And I started searching for any mention of influenza, whether it was a local case or a national case, something that was happening over in Europe. There was nothing. The local paper that I relied on the most was absolutely silent. And so I'm thinking to myself, hey, wow, we have done an excellent job. For once in history, a place like Harpers Ferry, which has had floods and John Brown and floods and Civil War and more floods, finally we have dodged a bullet in a major crisis and we have no influenza. There's nothing for me to talk about. Goodbye. Well, clearly that's not the case, or we wouldn't be talking about anything tonight.
Sure.
Let's talk about why there was silence. And we have this thing that has come to be called the Espionage and Sedition Acts. The Sedition Acts are the amendments to earlier World War I legislation, which was basically about preserving the war effort. The number one goal of our country at this time is to win this war, end this horrific war. So to do that, they wanted to discourage dissent. And so first we have the Espionage Act, which is more about people who are actively working perhaps to undermine the war effort. But then we have this extension with the Sedition Acts. And this is a broader law that applies very much to the press. It forbids the use of any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the government, the flag, the armed forces, or that causes us to view those institutions with contempt. It carried potentially between 5 and 20 years in prison. So how could that possibly relate to influenza? This came to be viewed as anything that would cause fear, that would cause people to question the war effort. As we saw cases that were potentially rising in Army training camps, people were perhaps trying to discourage going to the camps, continuing to raise troops for these camps, to stop shipping troops between camps, all of these things. If we're talking about influenza, we are talking about interfering with the war effort. This is one view that is promulgated at the time. So how do we know that this actually impacts the press? Well, there are cases. There are cases of small town newspapers coming under fire by their local governments, by the federal governments for publishing things about influenza, and they're invoking this act. Jefferson County, not West Virginia, Jefferson County, Wisconsin, sees their local newspaper prosecuted. They suffer a prosecution for publishing stories about influenza under the Wartime Sedition Acts. So there's a lot here for the press to be worried about. We see a lot of silence in the press generally about influenza, just general statements of stay calm, everything's fine. Bringing this back to Jefferson County, again, we've got this newspaper that's completely silent. So how do we know that that's really an impact? How do we know that they're really being subjected to this sort of censorship? How do we know that there was anything really going on? Well, there's another paper. There's another paper that is reporting locally and is not abiding by these restrictions. That would be our local paper here in Shepherdstown, which if we're comparing the papers at that time, we have a silent paper down the road in which influenza does not appear to be happening. And then we have the Shepherdstown paper that is filled with death notices, that is filled with all the closures going on around the county, that is filled with stories of people who are rising to become heroes, like doctors, instructors, shopkeepers, everyday people. So very different news reporting, and it's rare to find such rich reporting on influenza at this time. Like I said, there's the average is silence. So if you are a person who's not from this area, who is trying to find how influenza possibly impacted your local community, and it seemed like nothing happened, that may not be the case. There may be another place that you have to look to find that information.
Yeah, and I think that's an important kind of lesson. I mean, sometimes the sources run silent. In the period that I studied, the American Civil War era, if you're trying to retrieve the voices of the enslaved, for instance, and it's incredibly hard to find source materials related to them through traditional means. And so, as Catherine said, in many instances, you just need to simply dig deeper or look elsewhere. So the silences are sometimes very telling. And the paper they refer to is the Shepherdstown Registrar, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And I don't want to draw too many modern parallels here, but it is interesting, not so much that we're under censorship, but that there is this sort of eerie silence. I think about 2 months ago, as we're seeing events unfold in China and then in Italy, trying to understand exactly how things are spreading, you had to be very attuned to the news cycle. You had to listen quite actively to podcasts, read newspapers quite carefully to sort of understand how things were unfolding. And I think it's interesting how time in the midst of some of these crises sort of expands in peculiar ways, and events unfold sometimes very, very slowly to what becomes this incredibly infamous event. And so it's always interesting to me how things sort of unfold in so many different ways, in so many different fashions. In the case of Jefferson County, so when do we start seeing local audiences impacted by the disease, according to at least the Shepherdstown source? I mean, how does this start to unfold at the local level? And I guess my other question related to that is, what was going on globally at this point in time? So can you give us a little bit of a timeline for at least
Sure.
the handle?
So I think we already maybe covered this in the beginning. Influenza comes in waves. We begin to notice it on the global scale in the spring of 1918. And then it sort of dies away. And then it comes back with a vengeance in the fall. And it's possibly mutated slightly. It's had a chance to spread out as people have been traveling more activities going back and forth across the ocean, more activities of people moving around the country. So the first real notice that we have of influenza in Jefferson County is in that second wave.
Okay.
It's in that autumn of 1918. And it kind of still rolls then out into smaller waves as they get into 1919 as well. But just to give you an idea of how it appears to have hit, I looked at October 3rd. Influenza is something that's happening far away. This is how we're describing it. It's happening in the United States. It's in Pennsylvania, not so far away. It's in Pennsylvania. It's in places in Virginia. It's off in Ohio, Philadelphia, but nothing here. October 3rd. October 10th, we have a page of death notices.
Jeez.
The paper is only printed once a week.
Mm-hmm.
So just that much has transformed. And that next newspaper is what I call a nonsense paper, because it's been cobbled together so rapidly. Information was coming in so quickly. The newspaper staff is falling ill, falling out. The editor, even himself, becomes ill. And so you see newspaper, the page 1, somebody is sick, page 3, they're dead in the same newspaper. Okay. As the reports are just being jumbled together. They're also trying to cover what's happening in other towns in the area where things are not being reported, and where newspaper editors are also falling ill. At one point, they do get editors from other papers to come in, other newspaper printers to come in the staff and try to cobble these papers together. So it's very jumbled, very confused reporting. Even in this slow news period, you know, we can imagine the confusion that we face today with things like Twitter and all sorts of random stories flying at us. Here in a slow news period, they are still struggling to gather information with drastically reduced staff and having to bring people from other towns in just to get a paper out.
Okay. And, you know, I think what's so unusual about this virus is that it tends to impact healthy adults between the ages of about 15 and 34. Is that also the case, at least from what the records reveal? I mean, are those people who are succumbing to the disease in the local area in that healthy adult category?
I can't tell you how many times I had to stop when I was reading this and just walk away. Mm-hmm. From my computer for a while. The same stories pop up over and over again, different people, same storylines. It's a recent Shepherd University graduate who perhaps married somebody who has gone off to war, and either the person in the war has caught the disease, or the person at home, the new wife, has caught the disease, or they both have it. And that same storyline repeats over and over again. People in their early 20s who are just starting out in life, people who have just perhaps graduated from college and are a year or two into their running a business here in Jefferson County. Another storyline that comes up again and again are the mothers, the mothers of children. The mother will become ill caring for children who are sick, and the mother passes away, and then the babies begin to fall as well, just over and over again. So it's young people in the prime of their life who are just falling. It's a tremendous loss.
Do we have any sense from the records of what sort of long-term impact that has on the community? I mean, psychologically or emotionally? I mean, not only has the community been shaken by, again, the Great War or World War I, but now many people who are at the prime of their lives are falling ill, and then in some cases dying. Do we know anything about that, or is the record just simply, again, sort of silent in that regard?
I think that's a really interesting issue to look into. One of my other strange interests is prohibition, which kind of comes along, is developing around the same time as this is happening. And unfortunately, one of the emotional impacts of a pandemic is fear, and wanting to look for someone to blame. And that becomes part of the prohibition story as well, this wanting to hold someone responsible. So we see socially, we see saloons being blamed as the places of spreading disease, but we also see ethnic groups targeted. The concept of migrant workers who are in the apple orchards here, those groups become targeted as well, and they become targeted in the cause for prohibition.
And it might be useful here to step back for a minute, and I never quite know what our audience knows, but it is important to note that there is this nativist movement that erupts in the United States in the late 1840s, early 1850s. There's a flood of immigrants coming over after the revolutions in 1848. The events in Ireland, of course, around that same time. And so there is this anti-German, anti-Irish movement that really flourishes in many urban areas in the North. And so these are groups that have been targeted throughout the 19th century, moving into the early 20th. There are also, as Catherine noted, real concerns that start to emerge, especially during the industrial era and the rise of domesticity, that saloons and bars are undermining the family, undermining men's masculinity, and really doing great harm. And so it's interesting that that's also a touchstone for this topic, that it interfaces with that topic as well. I think what's so compelling maybe is how we can use, again, this microcosm to explore all these broader issues. But just to, again, just offer some broader context there, this is something that has sort of been slowly building throughout the 19th century, and then sort of explodes in the early 20th century with Prohibition, and then also the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan in 1916 and so on. So that's an interesting point.
Yeah, I don't know how much we can tie directly between those two, but certainly an experience like this, where we are losing so many people at once, generates so much fear, and fear is always fodder for unfortunate reactions.
And I think it might be interesting too, since you do bring up that point. So they have obviously advanced a lot in terms of medical knowledge, especially in the wake of the American Civil War. Medicine sort of moves exponentially in really productive ways. But at this point, do they have a lot of understanding of transmission? You said that they're looking towards saloons as potential, I guess, vectors, or as immigrant populations as potential vectors for disease. I mean, do they understand what's causing all this, and what kind of measures are they taking to sort of stymie it or halt it?
From what I understand, there's a lot of confusion. Okay. There is absolutely quality scientific research that is happening, especially within the military hospitals. They're trying to do as much as they can. So there is technology happening. They are working hard to understand and to target what this thing is and find the appropriate treatment for it. So there's absolutely a team at the top working on this. What's happening, though, as it filters down, if we're cutting off communication, it becomes harder to provide that information. So you have cases of doctors that may be inappropriately treating, using the technology that they have, not knowing that they are inappropriately treating the disease, but because there's a communication void, that they're unable to adapt to that. So yes, we have lots of wonderful research that's happening. They're working very quickly to try and mediate the situation, but we just have this communication. And if we're pretending that it's not a big deal, that really causes a problem in treatment.
Interesting. So the other element that we've sort of circled around but haven't really talked about is that there are still troops mobilizing, in theory, to go over to the Western Front. In the autumn of 1918, the war is still very much on. The end of it is anything but certain. Of course, we know it'll end on November the 11th. But nonetheless, I mean, what's the military situation in Jefferson County, and how does that interface with this pandemic?
We have quite a number of residents who have been drafted, who are going off to the training camps, which unfortunately are one of the most substantial breeding grounds for this disease. It spreads so rapidly. Another problem with the spread is that the training camps move. People move from camp to camp. So for instance, here in Jefferson County, we had a group of young men who started off at a camp in Virginia, and they were doing very well. They were healthy. Then one started to get sick in his final weeks there. They are then approved to sort of advance into a special tank unit, which is going to be trained in Gettysburg. So this group of guys go up to Gettysburg to the next step in their training. They're going to be tank guys. And that's where they start to fall. Not only have they now moved, not only are they getting sick there, but now they potentially help spread the disease to the Gettysburg camp. So it's situations like that where people are coming in, they might pick something up. Nationally, we're seeing instances, between Northern Virginia and Gettysburg is not so long to travel by train. But in longer troop transfers, we're seeing cases of people actually contracting the disease. They're so ill that they're actually on their deathbed by the time they get to their destination. In Jefferson County, what we see a lot of is, unfortunately, people have been moved from camp to camp, and then they're coming back to us in coffins. That's how they're returning home. They've never made it to the battlefield. They've never left the United States. They're coming home from their training camps in coffins because of influenza.
I think too, this is one of those instances where I think the families and the culture is entirely unprepared for that, right? I mean, the expectation is that you don't want a young man to perish in war, but this is at the very close of the Victorian era, and there's still, I think, some very specific ideas attached to that is a good death ultimately, right? And a righteous death. And the worst thing that could possibly happen is instead an individual perishes back stateside, and then because of disease. So we have a question, if I may. The question is, how long did it take the military, and I guess the question may refer to the United States, to sort of figure out how big this problem was going to become? And so again, as you noted, the military is contributing to the issue because they're congregating large numbers of men together and then transporting men in different directions, and by so doing, transporting the disease with them. How quickly was the military able to control the situation, or were they at all?
Again, we started with this talking about censorship.
Right.
And how censorship relates to influenza. One of the main reasons for that is people were trying to talk, they were trying to speak out about the dangers of camps and how they were spreading disease. So there are doctors who are working within the military who are noticing that something big is happening, and they do notice that pretty early, but trying to get a team together to respond does take some time. There are some really excellent books that have come out recently on that topic that I can maybe refer you to. The Great Influenza was published a couple years ago on the anniversary. And that really goes into the detail of how the doctors within the military were fighting to come together to break through this wall of censorship and to be able to just address it.
Okay. And eventually it was addressed, right? I mean, so by 1919, the situation looks pretty different. Is that correct?
Yeah. After the war, of course, things are a little easier. We're not under so many social pressures regarding sedition anymore. So after the war, people are continuing to do the research, and certainly at that point, they're much closer to be able to solve it. But we're still seeing waves of the disease come and go.
Okay.
Even into the 1920s.
Sure. There's another question is interesting, as asking, did the pandemic at all contribute to the sort of isolationist swing that the United States has, and did it have any sort of impact on the next presidential election? And I'll say very quickly before I turn it over to you, I mean, really since Washington's administration, there was this stance that the United States actively took that they would not involve themselves in the affairs of Europe by and large. There's a shift in the late 19th century. We become more involved in Central and South America. At the very beginning of World War I, we are very much opposed to entering that conflict in any sort of clear way. So I will say there's a good deal of historical precedent for this isolationist stance or positions of neutrality that the United States took, but can you find any correlation there? So on the one hand, for the isolationist swing, and then two, do you have any sort of idea that this pandemic impacted the presidential election of 1920?
I think, yes, as you said, there has been an isolationist tendency for quite some time. But certainly, as I said before, that element of fear is so so encouraging to isolationism. We see the influenza becomes tied to ethnicities, tied to this was something that was brought from Europe, which, you know, we now have information that says it might have actually started here.
Right. Right. Yeah.
It's called the Spanish influenza because Spain was one of the few countries that was actually talking about it, not because it necessarily started there. So
labels mean a lot, as we know.
Yeah. So I think that element of fear does have a lot to do in encouraging it. I don't think it sparks the isolationism. And I think there are a whole number of issues that kind of tie into that next election cycle.
Yeah, I think that's
one.
Fair. And, you know, yeah, no, I think you're fair, but I think it's certainly a factor. And I think the other factor that you highlight so well is that the 1920s is this era. On the one hand, there's this booming economy, quite famously. There's literature flourishes, art flourishes. But again, we see the second rise of the Ku Klux Klan. There's a strong nativist movement that consumes literally millions of Americans. There's a very specific swing that occurs because of the Great War, perhaps to some extent because of the Spanish flu. You know, we can't maybe isolate a specific factor, but when we look at that broader context, that certainly it creates a sea change. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And so it's certainly impactful on a number of different fronts. To bring it back home here a bit, can you give us some sense, again, we've talked about it in sort of broad terms, but how dramatically did this impact the local community? I mean, you know, do we have some sense from the newspapers, how many people were infected, how many people unfortunately died? Do we have some sense in how those numbers in turn look at a national or global level? Was it less, you know, here as opposed to elsewhere?
I can tell you that if we're just looking at straight percentages, it looks pretty much even to what the rest of the country is experiencing. In terms of the impact on the community, things that sort of cut through the core. Again, I talked earlier about this being the slow news period, where we have one paper that's coming out a week, that's the source of your news. Or maybe letters that you're sending. We do have telephones, but in this day and age, in that day and age rather, the telephone call is made by dialing an operator who then puts the wire in the right circuit and you are able to connect to whomever you're calling. So imagine what it means to shut down communication, because that's exactly what happens. I talked earlier about the problem the newspapers were having with their staff and their printing people falling ill. One of the things that really struck me was the story of the telephone operators. We had 7 and 6 of them were ill.
Oh, geez. Okay.
So then there was a big story about pleading with citizens who are probably so anxious, trying to check in on their relatives, trying to see who's sick, do you need something, how can I help you, how are you doing? They're being told not to place anything other than an emergency call because we only have one young woman who is able to work right now. Everybody else is sick. And unfortunately, one of them did succumb to the disease. But just things like that, this silencing of communication and further isolating. And these aren't policies that are coming down from on high. It's just the people are unable to work.
Yeah, and I apologize for going back to the Civil War, but it's what I know.
Yeah.
But what's eerie about that, though, is a similar complaint circulates in this area in late 1861 and into 1862. Mary Bettinger, who's a young girl who lives in Shepherdstown, talks about this as kind of the community that's been forgotten, right? They have no idea of what's going on in the war. They have no idea how events are unfolding. And then in the autumn, again, coincidentally, of 1862, the war comes to this area in a very big way and impacts the community in a very direct way, with the number of casualties that stream into Shepherdstown. Harpers Ferry, of course, has a siege. So it is interesting how that's been an element of this area for decades in the 19th and then into the 20th century. So it's just one of those interesting kind of parallels. And even today, to some extent, despite being constantly in communication, it has a sort of isolated quality to it. You know, we're kind of, at least in Shepherdstown, well, and in Harpers Ferry, shielded by these mountains and sort of set off in some ways around the Potomac. And so it's an interesting phenomenon. So I don't want to put you on the spot here, but yesterday I worked with Civil War medicine on a program, and I think one of the things that they try to do in their mission is understand the relevancy of the past, draw sort of lessons or connections. And so what is sort of a concluding idea, statement, remark? Can you tell us why not only does the Spanish flu matter, but why does it matter in this local context?
I feel that by looking at our local story, as I said at the beginning, it kind of provides us with a lens to examine the world at large. Sometimes these big stories can seem so far away, so massive, but it's something that happens to other people. But no, that by looking at it through our lens here, these are storefronts that we pass that were impacted. These are the streets that we walk on. These are our communities. The graveyard down the street from my house is full of these people who suffered and perished in this time. In terms of what to take away from this for the future, I think number one is always truth telling. I think that that's one of the greatest lessons that we have from that time period. The suppression of media, this fear of publishing stories about influenza, the disconnect between the scientists and the public really caused so much unnecessary pain and really did a disservice to trying to contain this disease appropriately. I don't know what impact it could have. We can create all sorts of fantastical scenarios about how it might have been different if people had more information. I think maybe there's only so much you can do to fight a pandemic, and it's going to be bad at some level. But I think that's probably one of our big takeaways is not to be afraid to face the hard story, even if it seems like it might be too frightening, it might depress people. Being able to hold those stories and look at them and convey information, even if the news is bad, can help make the next story better.
So a message of hope then, right? To some extent, realism and hope. Guarded realism, guarded hope maybe is the best phrase. Well, with that, I want to thank you very much, Catherine. Again, Catherine and I are associated with the George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War, part of Shepherd University. We have had and will continue to have a whole host of online programming, not only through the auspices of the George Tyler Moore Center, but we've partnered with organizations like the American Battlefield Trust, the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, Civil War Times, and so on. And so we deeply appreciate your time this evening. To our audience members, we'd encourage you to visit our websites, like us on Facebook, which you've probably already done, thus you're here. But nonetheless, share these videos, share our page, and stay healthy and be well. And Catherine, you want to say goodbye?
All right, thanks everybody for tuning in.
Okay. Thank you all so much. Have a good evening. We deeply appreciate it. Bye.
Bye.